Good lunchtime from the Riga conference coffee break. My name is Kadri Liik. I'm Senior Fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm joined by Jan Techau from the Carnegie Brussels Center and Thomas Wright from Brookings in order to discuss the future of European foreign policy. Our discussion will be somewhat linked to the project that GMF has been handling over the last year. This has resulted in 4 foreign policy scenarios. You all can, I believe, download the paper from the Riga conference website. And what we have been doing, we have been discussing the nature of a European crisis, different outcomes of it, and where, in terms of foreign policy, these different outcomes would lead us. And we have ended up with 4 foreign policy scenarios reflecting disintegration of European Union, partial disintegration, partial integration, and full integration. Let's, just to give due credit to GMF and everyone who has been handling it, let's discuss a little bit about the process. I mean, all of us have been part of the meetings, either all 3 or 2. So what did you learn by doing it?
I think I learned that when you put a select group of experts together that are supposed to talk about the future of Europe, and you bring them in from all over the place, Europe, outside Europe, and so on and so forth, first of all, they can very quickly identify the rough routes along which this will develop. They will not agree, but they will agree on, that there are basically 3 or 4 options that can happen, no matter how you organize the process. That's actually quite clear. So there is a bit of a consensus as to what the options are for Europe in the future. And then the other question, of course, that comes out of these kinds of processes is, once you have the model, what do you make of it? And I think this is where the question stands now. We've discussed this very broadly, and we all have a general aim at improving the EU foreign policy performance of the European Union. But how to best push forward is something that didn't come out in a consensual way afterwards. But lots of very good ideas, tidbits of information and suggestions and possible way forward are in the document, and that's the entire usefulness of the thing.
Thomas.
Yes, I found the project very interesting, and it was terrific to be involved with it from the beginning. The real benefit of the project that the German Marshall Fund organised was to really drill down into each of the 4 scenarios. So, as Jan said, we've sort of known roughly the scenarios coming out of the euro crisis, but I think that we hadn't really dug as deep into them as we needed to before this project. And so I'd recommend the booklet to everyone. Each scenario is very sort of detailed and developed, and it sort of has a strategic look, like looking at one thing happens, then what are the consequences for lots of other aspects of the EU, and then looking sort of in the future to what that means for Europe's role in the world. So it's the meetings. There was 3. There was one here last year in Riga, one in Brussels in the springtime, and then here again today, and each sort of played an important role in bringing the report to fruition.
And to me, the highlight actually was, I think it was a Brussels meeting where we were asked to think of newspaper headlines referring to different scenarios. And when we were doing scenarios for European full integration, that became quite a game. We came up with kind of sort of blunt, tough, powerful headlines that sort of reflected American behavior at the heyday of its power. And we somehow grew in stature and looked more self-confident to ourselves. So I wonder, under the reality now, what would it take to kind of give more self-confidence to European foreign policy, to really get our act together? Let's leave the scenarios aside for a while, or let's say resort to a scenario of partial integration, that I think is the one that looks most plausible now, and certain things that are predicted there are coming true already. But how to make Europe act more meaningfully? What is it that we lack? Do we lack attention to foreign policy? for the crisis years, foreign ministers have been a marginalized constituency in the European Union. Focus has been so much elsewhere. Is that the reason? Or is the reason that we just don't know what to do in this world that is increasingly messy? Or do we just not invest diplomatic energy? Or what is our problem?
I think if you want to boil it down to one sentence, it is a lack of a sense of urgency. We do have a fabulous continent that has come a long way since the end of World War II, and we have not only much to preserve, but we have much to lose in a globalized world that we are unprepared for mentally to deal with. But we also have much to win, because very few other parts of the planet are as well prepared for a globalized world as we are. And so that the lack of urgency, that there's something shifting fundamentally and that we need to draw the conclusions from it, I think that's the biggest problem we have at the moment. If you do have a sense of urgency, you will create political will. And if you do have political will, you will create resources which can then be turned into action and into impact and relevance. But you have to start with a sense of urgency. And my feeling is that this is not available in large enough a quantity at the moment.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I would put it a slightly different way, that I think in addition to the lack of urgency, there is a sense that foreign policy isn't a necessary competence, or isn't something that Europe has to do in order to, survive in the world, that it's almost a luxury or something that can be dealt with later. And that's partly because we have, problems, but they don't seem to be so pressing or so existential that everyone has no option but to engage in it. I mean, a useful sort of contrast is in the economic crisis, where the ferocity of the economic crisis has forced, European countries to try to engage in these issues much more than they have in the past. There's been lots of differences, there's been lots of problems, much remains to be done, but, most summits are taken up with, leaders working and finance ministers working closely together to try to figure out a pathway through. That it's the crisis that generated that. In foreign policy at the moment, there are all these challenges out there that are important, but there isn't the same sense of, a crisis, and so it's sort of pushed to the side and then is compounded by, defence budget cuts and sort of a reduction in capabilities, and also in an intention to engage. And I think the concern will be that in time that this will come back in the form of a crisis, but Europe will be not that well prepared for it, because of it hasn't sort of taken advantage of the opportunities that it has now.
Making use of the fact that you're based in Washington, I mean, how different actually is America? Because Jan, you sort of pointed to something that I have been thinking about a lot, that very few countries actually seem to be doing foreign policy. I mean, in the sense of identifying close, mobilizing resources and moving. I mean, many countries just give speeches, and that applies a lot to Obama as well. And my impression is that it has something to do with the world changing in so many aspects. I mean, power centers are shifting and we don't quite know where. China is rising, but how powerful will that, what will that eventually mean? Nature of democracy is changing, popular empowerment, leaders that are ever more managers, ever less kind of charismatic ideological leaders, plus information technology and everything that this means for us. So it's kind of overall change, and it's very hard to establish a strategic direction in these circumstances. I mean, how different in that sense United States is from Europe? Does the United States still have a sense of urgency when it comes to foreign policy? Or does sense of urgency only come about occasionally as a result of domestic demands, such as, say, Syria debate now?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I do think there is an important difference. I mean, it is true that, in the United States, people are tired after, 12 years of conflicts and of 2 wars that proved to be quite difficult, and there is a desire, as there has often been in post-World War II American history, of sort of, there's a time when the country is very engaged and very active, and then there's a time afterwards where it goes a little bit in the other direction, and it's sort of a pendulum. I don't think I wouldn't overstate to the degree to which people want to focus on problems at home rather than that being engaged abroad, but there is a little bit of that. But I think that even with that there, the US is still, very engaged in the world. So in Asia over the last, 10 years, particularly over the last 5, there's been a very robust engagement, an increase in US involvement, a deepening of partnerships and alliances, and a massive increase in activism. It hasn't been on the, military conflict side, thankfully, but it has been on, defense partnerships, politics, economics, and across the board. So I think that is, that's the rebalance strategy, but that is a important thing to keep in mind. The issue has arisen really in the Middle East, and even there, I think because of, I think the administration handled it badly for the last sort of year or so on Syria, but even there you see with the chemical weapons use that, the US is sort of pushing and leading to try to have an active, response. So I think that there, US engagement is still, internationalism is still alive and well. I think there's definitely room for improvement, but there is, but it's not, I think the, case is turning inward. I think in Europe, it varies by country to country. So it's not the EU as a whole maybe isn't as committed as engaged.
Well, coming to country by country, coming to European countries. Let's talk a little bit about Germany, because all these scenarios mention Germany as the leader, or Germany as first among equals. So for whatever reasons, it seems that in order to get European foreign policy on a firmer footing, we need kind of strong investment from Germany. But Germany seems to be very cautious in becoming committed in investing. Although, the plus side is that once it does, you kind of can believe that this is serious. This is not just posturing for domestic audience, but they actually mean it. But Jan, you come from Germany yourself. Explain to us a little bit German foreign policy thinking, its origins, Germany's attitude towards foreign policy. Everyone is expecting Germany to assume this leadership role, but Germany, when I was organizing a similar conference in Estonia, we had a big session on Germany, and it was titled, "Germany, a reluctant leader of a lost continent?" ?
Well, that's an interesting label. To get the complexity of the Germany problem, if you will, in foreign policy, is not something that you can do in a minute or two. But what one can say is that certainly the strategic foreign policy ambition of the country is very, very low, and there are a number of reasons for that. Partly it has to do with history, obviously. The Germans feel still fundamentally uncomfortable about themselves as a proactive and assertive foreign policy player. This is something that they learned after World War II they shouldn't be. And they have completely internalized that message. And it's now very difficult to break out of the mold of that strategic culture, once it was actually done and solidified. That's number one. Certainly there's also a bit of strategic laziness there. The country learned in 40, 50 years of not being an independent player in foreign policy that it didn't have to ask the crucial questions of the survival itself. This was done by others for Germany, specifically by the US. And that creates a political culture inside the country that gets unaccustomed to these kinds of questions. No resources or very little resources are being fed into these kinds of questions. When you were a young, aspiring, talented German politician in the 70s or 80s, you would not go into foreign policy to make it big. You would go elsewhere because foreign policy was just not a career field. It's a number of scattered, but connected factors that have brought Germany into the position that it is in now. And then to top it off, essentially, we currently have a government that is ultra cautious when it comes to committing Germany to strategic bigger questions, especially to military questions and to the use of force. Angela Merkel learned in 2002 when Gerhard Schröder snatched away the elections that the Conservatives thought they had won already, snatched it away from them by playing a very populist anti-war card against the Iraq War at the time, and that took the election victory away from the Conservatives. This has completely sunken in with her. For her, the entire idea of committing German forces is a vote loser, is something that she thinks she can't put in front of the German people. So if you count these factors together, and there are a number of other factors as well, you have the country that we see at the moment. The problem with this is if Germany is disengaged intellectually and materially and politically disengaged from this crucial question, it will lose the integration process, because foreign policy has now become such an important part of the integration process, is now such an important movement, such an important kind of driver of integration, that you can't just, separate internal European integration and external action any longer. That was possible for a long, long time, not any longer. And this is why Germany, the reluctant foreign policy player, becomes a problem for the integration process.
So what does it take to change it inside Germany?
That's a question that many smart people and many much smarter people than me have tried to answer. I think time will be required. The question is, do we have enough of it? Another question is, will there be also in Germany at the national level be the sense of urgency, the sense of responsibility that, all of a sudden it dawns to people that no, we can't be in that niche of world politics that we were in for 2 generations. We can't be in it any longer. And more is asked of us. That's something that needs to sink in. That's an educational process. That's also a bit of a generational process. And then another factor that could potentially change it is that our partners and allies keep on asking the tough questions and push Germany and push it a little harder and a little further, because without that big, boy in the middle of Europe, nothing can happen. Germany is the swing state, and the Germans are, to a large extent, unaware of it.
Yeah, I remember I was in Berlin when Radek gave his famous Germany speech, German action versus German inaction, and that actually created quite some debate, I think, in Germany. At least the whole town was talking about the next day, and in very thoughtful manner. Thomas, do you have any comments or additional questions about the German question?
I think the German position is very interesting. It's yesterday Germany was the only European country at the G20 not to sign the statement with the United States and others on Syria. I think I think you're exactly right that was almost entirely to do with the election and sort of the concerns about it being politically unpopular. But I think actually that tells us something, that it is politically unpopular, that the domestic politics, are not sort of supportive of playing an active role. And that, in a way that does actually accurately reflect, the country in a way that if it was after the election and Merkel, did sign on, it would be maybe her, view, but not the sort of view of the country as a whole. And we also had the Libya episode where Germany sort of opted out of that too. And I think that when you look at what happened in the UK and particularly the Prime Minister's response to that and sort of ruling out military action, we are seeing in Europe sort of from the ground up sort of a desire to have a bit of an exemption slip from playing an active role in upholding the international order. And I think that's a concern to the United States, just as some of those similar dynamics within the US are also of concern, because people are tired, I think, after the last decade, but also because of the economic crisis. But it's up to leaders to try to explain that it's still important, even at this sort of tough time, to remain engaged and to be active, because not to do so will just create a vacuum that will lead to greater problems and greater threats that we'll have to deal with down the road.
I would like to add one point about the question of how much leadership is possible in Germany and how much of a popular support you can possibly get for a more assertive kind of position. It is interesting, 4 years ago, around the last elections in Germany, people were asked, do you support Germany's engagement in Afghanistan? And about 75% of the people said, no, we don't think we should be there, let's get out of there. But then when you ask them, was the Afghanistan issue important enough for you to actually cast your vote based on that consideration? About 2 to 3% of the people said yes. That's within the margin of error of these kinds of polls. So what you have is a population that says, no, we don't like it, but at the same time it's not a priority for them. We don't like it, but it's also not really important for us. And I think in that delta between we don't like it, but it's not important, is room for political leadership. I think the German political elite is collectively unaware of that they actually do have a lot more maneuvering space on the foreign policy side than they think they do. And this is one of the conundrums, I think, that the German political elite at some point needs to break out of. It is not easy for any democracy to go to war. And Tom has just alluded to some of the recent developments in Europe, but it's never easy, not even for the United States or some of the more hawkish kind of political cultures. And so it's never going to be easy, even in Germany. But I think political elites are unaware of the fact that they probably do have a little bit more political capital for this kind of thing that they themselves think they have.
Yes, I think Germany could do a lot more. Yesterday, I had privately discussed German foreign policy. I also mentioned Germany's Russia policy, and a few years back, when the relations between Russia and Eastern European countries were still quite tense, I told one pretty senior German diplomat that Germany seems to think that it needs to choose between the friendship of East Europeans and that of Russia, and Russia is lucrative business-wise, but also kind of morally important for historical reasons, and you choose Russia. But actually, you don't have to choose. Germany is the country in Europe and possibly in the world that can actually make these tensions go away by just letting Russia know that certain type of behavior is unacceptable and first and foremost is bad for Russia itself. And this diplomat thought very seriously and said, yes, you might be right, but we don't think of us as a player with such capacity. We think of us as a small, insecure West Germany. So, when it comes to Russia, the tone of German debate has changed. There is lots of gloom and pessimism about internal developments in Russia, and duly so. But when and how will it translate into policies? We don't quite see much going beyond statements occasionally. And different agencies, different institutions inside German government seems to have different positions.
I can't give you a timeline on the growing up process of Germany. That's just not possible.
Yeah, so sad. Everyone is waiting for exactly that.
Yes. We thought in the late 90s that, with Kosovo and the German participation in the non-UN mandated intervention in Kosovo, that this would be a game changer, but it wasn't. Then we thought it could possibly be Afghanistan that is a game changer. Germany has been there from the beginning, is still there, unlike some other European countries. And so, but it wasn't a game changer. And some people argue now that with Merkel, actually, we've gone back and have taken steps back in terms of our assertiveness and readiness to engage. So it's very difficult to say how this is going to play out. I won't give you any kind of timeline for this, but what I can say is that I think it's absolutely right that one never has to choose. By thinking that you have to choose between your Eastern European partners and Russia, you're kind of succumbing to the same zero-sum logic that we always accused the Russians of. Mm-hmm. And that's absolutely not the case. What it requires, however, is two things. First of all, a super sensitive kind of antenna for what's playing with your partners and with Russia. And secondly, extreme diplomatic skill. Germany, when you look at Germany's position in the map and its size, it's very clear. It's the big thing in the center of Europe. It has 9 neighbors, which almost no other country this size has in the world. And it is condemned to have the best diplomats, the finest antennas, the most refined strategic culture. The problem is it has none of those. And this is what it's struggling with, and this is what it needs to develop if it wants to strike the fine balance between the two things that you've mentioned. I think it's perfectly possible, but it is an enormous foreign policy task. And without more resources, a changed political culture, and a stronger sense of urgency and a stronger sense of self, I think that's going to take a long time.
Thomas, you have certain things to add.
I think that's right, and I think that I think from a U.S. perspective, the faster that that transition occurs and that Germany works with other European countries, and to take a more active role in the world, that would be a positive thing. On your point about the I think you're exactly right that we can't sort of frame this in an either or thing. So whether that's for the EU with Russia and sort of partners, or in Asia between China and sort of partners in Asia, that it's always a mistake to sort of create a dichotomy where you've got to choose one or the other. And the reality is we have to do both. And so we need to sort of build the Western order and work with partners and countries that want to work with us, whether that's in Europe or in the United States, and at the same time develop strong bilateral relationships with countries that may be more competitors and partners like Russia and China. And I think that's the challenge of diplomacy in the 21st century, is to be able to play at those different levels, and to try. And my own view is that really getting the region right, whether it's in Europe or in Asia, and having sort of a broad engagement will help you get the bilateral relations right. So a good relationship with Russia is more likely to occur when Europe has strong engagement with its neighbourhood and strong relations with its partners. And similarly in Asia, for Europe or the United States, strong engagement with the region as a whole means that you're in a better position to have a good bilateral relationship with China. And so I think actually there are parallels between the two, between Europe and Asia in that. But it is a tricky sort of diplomatic thing to pull off.
Yeah, you mentioned neighborhood. Just during the previous session, the Belarusian deputy foreign minister said that I think she was referring to the same policy scenarios, that neighbors are not even mentioned here. Well, she just didn't know actually that during the scenario exercise, so we discussed neighbors a lot, which scenario will make EU more attractive to Eastern neighbors or potential applicant countries. So they were by no means neglected, even though Belarus may not have been mentioned here. But also when it, she might be right that our sort of neighborhood policy is slightly stuck, or we don't. This kind of Eastern Partnership was well meant, but it doesn't seem to work in ways that people may have maybe naively hoped, inspiring domestic reform in these countries, because they all have much tougher geopolitical or just mercantile choices to make than the kind of previous set of applicant countries. So how can I go about that? Right now there's a sort of frustrating story with occasional dramas such as the Vilnius summit, who signs association agreement, who not, how much can Russia create havoc before that, but otherwise there is sort of big fatigue surrounding these countries that are going through this bumpy development that is not even dramatic enough. So how can we fix our neighborhood?
The problem seems to be that there are strong differences between the European member states, among European member states, as to how forcefully this tool should be used. Some want to press ahead with it very robustly. For others, it's a sideshow. And to create this kind of unity is difficult. And if you don't have that unity, you don't have the same kind of horsepower in the program. The other thing is that also we are very fickle when it comes to our dedication to this. We had super high hopes on Ukraine that has not really fully materialized, and now we're agonizing over the question whether the association agreement is whether we should sign it or not. We've hopped from one hope to the next. Ukraine didn't work. Belarus seems to be hopeless. Moldova is willing but kind of stuck, and it continues like this. And it seems like we're not making a lot of progress. And then another problem is that, of course, we have this kind of one-size-fits-all approach, which we've recently changed and tried to have a bit more of a kind of individual approach to each different country. But because you have to lump them together somehow, that also creates an instrument that is maybe not refined enough. So, reforming the instrument is a useful thing. In the end, however, and I think this is the most important thing, in the end, no matter how refined the instrument is, and no matter how unified Europe is, the recipient countries, the neighborhood countries, they need to actually want it. They need to want it. They need to basically, the ball is more in their court than it is in the European court. With political unwillingness, as we can see it almost everywhere in the neighborhood, you will make very, very little progress. So yes, Brussels has problems, but I think the bigger problems are even in the region.
Tom.
Yes, no, I think that's exactly. I mean, I think that's exactly right, and I think it's also true that it's partly because of the euro crisis and because of the difficulties that the European Union has that makes an active sort of engagement a bit tougher, and it creates some uncertainty about the future. But I think that we still see strong we still see it, that there's a need for that engagement, and there's a need for those partnerships. But it works. It's both a matter for within the European Union, but then, as Jan also said, within the partner countries too.
We have 2 or 3 minutes left, so not much, but I would want to conclude this conversation by having a look at the future of transatlantic partnership. Because all these scenarios also mention that the importance for Europe for the United States is declining. At the same time, the United States would be worried if there was kind of collapse and disintegration in Europe. But I wonder, what could, in so many ways, United States and Europe are still like perfect partners when it comes to values, worldviews, government types, etc. But sort of our ability to coordinate and act together seems to be declining. And partly this has to do, with countries' willingness to invest in defense, etc. There is huge disparity. But defense expenditure is not the only thing there is. Diplomatic expenditure is another thing. You mentioned diplomats and kind of fine-tuned antennas. I think that is really important. And the United States doesn't have that for each region in the world. Inevitably, if you're the United States, you're bound to have some attention deficit when it comes to obscure corners of the world. So in a way, that would be kind of perfect cooperation where you could fill in certain gaps for the United States. So what does it take to get that sort of thing going?
It's a great question. I think the first thing to be said is that for the United States, it's not that Europe is less important. Europe is America's sort of closest partner, and the American and European interests are more closely aligned now than they have been, for many decades. There's a lot of sort of common interests. The problem is, the view maybe in certain parts in the US that Europe will do less because it wants to do less, or because it can only do less, and in that way the role of the transatlantic alliance may be less influential than it once was. But that's something that's a fear rather than an expectation or a preference. So I think it is, and it works the other way too. Obviously there's some concern about US leadership as well, but I think these are things that can be fixed by leaders. I think there is room, as you say, to have a sort of a division of labour, but we also should recognise that everyone will have to stay involved in all areas too. So the US will do more in Asia, but it will be good if Europe is involved in Asia. Europe will hopefully take on more of the burden, in North Africa and its neighbourhood, but the US will still need to be engaged as well. So I think it's, there will be a slight sort of, division of burden sharing depending on the region, but that shouldn't mean that anyone can sort of disengage, because both Europe and the US will need to work together on all of these issues.
Jan, short final word is yours.
I think the dirty little secret of transatlantic relations is that about 80 to 90% of it is very boring. We have a huge trade volume. We have fantastic connections and cooperation on all kinds of technical issues, on foreign policy issues around the world. None of this ever makes the headlights, the limelight and the headlines. So this is where the transatlantic relationship is extremely settled, and developed and intricate. And that's what's always forgotten. It's a very solid and very healthy relationship. The 10%, however, that make the headlines are the ones that are problematic, and this is the geopolitical stuff. This is the question of how much of a partner Europe can be in the pressing, urgent questions of global governance, liberal world order, and all of these big questions. I think for the most part this will depend on the question whether the Europeans can develop a sense of the Americans and us are in it together. This kind of we are the West and we need to stick together. That's the kind of conscience that the Europeans need to deliver. The ball is in this case in their court. Delivery, performance will be the decisive question in the transatlantic relationship in those 10% that make the headlines and that keep us busy at these conferences.
Thank you all. Thank you, Riga Conference. I hope we have given our small work to make transatlantic community stick together and be effective. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.